So I'm going to talk to you about religious liberty, okay? And when you say the words religious liberty in our current culture, people often think what? Bigots, haters, homophobes. They have no conception of what religious liberty means, other than, this sort of popular conception that when somebody speaks about religious liberty, what they're speaking about is their ability to inflict their religion on others without that other person's consent. Religious liberty has a bad name now. So I want to talk about religious liberty in a little bit of a different context. First, let's define it, okay? Now here's your challenge. You want to define religious liberty in a way that is compelling to a culture where the largest growing group of, the largest growing religious group are the nuns, okay? Not the nuns, not these nuns, okay? The nuns of no particular religious faith and religious affiliation. That's the largest group of people in the the largest growing religious group or non-religious group in the United States are the nuns. So, and these people also disproportionately occupy the halls of power in academia, the halls of power in Hollywood, the halls of power in government. So how do you define religious liberty in a way that makes sense to these folks? These are the folks who look at people like me, people of faith, and look at me as somewhat irrational. They're not necessarily dedicated to making sure I have more liberty if I'm going to use it to advocate or advance something that they believe is fundamentally irrational and just about as credible as the flying spaghetti monster. So what is religious liberty? I think the best definition that I've heard of religious liberty that resonates with pretty much every single human being is religious liberty is the liberty to believe and act, this is very critical, believe and act in accordance with your most deeply held beliefs. In other words, what is it that animates the core of your being, the most important beliefs and thoughts that you have? Religious liberty is the liberty to believe that and to act in accordance with your beliefs. That's what it is. When you describe it like that, it begins to make sense as to why we would give people space to believe and to act in accordance with their most deeply held beliefs. Let's talk about history a little bit, okay? When you begin to understand that what we're dealing with are the most important views and thoughts and ideals that any person has, you begin to understand why religious liberty is an absolute necessity, just an absolute necessity if a nation is going to not only prosper, but literally remain united, remain together. All right, so I live in Columbia, Tennessee. Who here has heard of Columbia, Tennessee? Like 2 people. This is awesome. We need to do better marketing for mule. It's the mule capital of the world, okay? So allegedly, we have more mules per capita than in any other community in the United States of America. Don't Google or fact check that. I don't know if that's got any Pinocchios, that assertion will have any Pinocchios attached to it. But we claim to be the mule capital. We have an annual Mule Day Parade. It's amazing. It's like redneck Woodstock. You absolutely have to come to it when you can. But we're also a community of churches. There's just one road that you drive up and down. Middle Tennessee is very different from Southern California. We are overrun with churches. You drive up and down the road, and you will pass Presbyterian, Episcopal, 19 variations of Church of Christ, Assemblies of God, Southern Baptist after Southern Baptist after Southern Baptist. You wonder, why do we need 6 Southern Baptist churches in a square mile? Can't we just have 2, 1? You'll just pass church after church after church, and it's the most normal thing imaginable. We don't even think twice about it. But it wasn't that long ago that if you had those different denominations in that close a proximity, it was going to get bloody. It wasn't just going to be angry, it was going to be bloody. I mean, our church bulletin of my Presbyterian church, I'm a proud member of the Presbyterian Church in America. I was predestined to be that from a young age. And our church bulletin, if this was, a few hundred years ago, would be something like worship at 11 p.m., burning the Assembly of God deacon at the stake at 1 p.m., or worship at 11 p.m., a.m., burning the Assembly of God deacon at the stake at 1 p.m. I mean, it would have been that level of hostility. We forget that. We sort of think nowadays of Christianity as just one sort of big, happy family of people who have some mild doctrinal differences. But that's just not the way it was at all. Let's think about the founding of our own country. Okay, I'm going to draw a terrible map here. Okay, but this is our eastern I promise you this is our eastern seaboard. Okay, so here's Maine. Okay, there's Florida. Looks more like a dinosaur. There's his eye. No, but anyway, so here's the eastern seaboard. And if you look at migration to the United States, you had very distinct different religious groups migrating to very distinctly different parts of the country. So you have the Puritans coming over, and they land in Massachusetts and start the Massachusetts colony. It's essentially, for a while, a Puritan utopia. You have Quakers coming down to Pennsylvania. You have Catholics coming down to Maryland. You have Anglicans coming down more predominantly to Virginia. And you have criminals coming down to Georgia, where they remain. And so you look at that now and you think, well, this is just like a road in Tennessee where you just have, you have your Reformed church, you have your Quakers, you have your Episcopalians, or your Catholics, Episcopalians. That's just like a road in the South. But all of this was occurring in the pretty recent aftermath of one of the most dreadful events in the history of Western civilization. It's something we don't really talk about now all that much because there's been a lot more dreadful events since, but they're called the Wars of Religion. Okay, the wars of religion that racked Europe during the Reformation, towards the end of the Reformation, were a cataclysmic event. We can't fully comprehend how cataclysmic they were, again, because World War I, World War II, the Napoleonic Wars all happened after that, and they were cataclysmic in their own ways. But until, I believe, World War I, the most deadly event in Europe, aside from the Black Death, the most deadly military event in Europe, in European history, were the wars of religion. And they were fought between many of these same groups who are now settling on the eastern seaboard of the United States. So how on earth are these people going to live together? Because they're coming from traditions where the king was also often the head of the church. So in Great Britain, for example, the king was the head of the church. He was the ultimate religious authority, the ultimate political authority, and the ultimate military authority. Not all that different from a caliph in the Ottoman Empire. All of that authority was concentrated in the hands of one man. And so this was never going to work unless we began to reach an arrangement whereby people of all of these different faiths could agree that they would give each other enough space to what? Believe and act in accordance with their deepest beliefs. Now, there wasn't a huge atheist contingent at that time, so when you're crafting the First Amendment, these words were carefully chosen. Free exercise of religion. Free exercise. It's not just freedom to believe. It's not freedom of worship. You will often hear a lot of people describe religious liberty as the freedom of worship. No, worship is a small part of the religious experience. These words are very deliberately chosen. Free exercise of religion. In other words, you could be religious in accordance with your deepest beliefs. And that's about the only way all of these people could live together. But there was a corollary to that. Not only did you have the free exercise of religion, there was no establishment. And by that they meant no national establishment of religion. George Washington was not going to be the head of state and also the chief ruling elder of the national church. No, that was not going to happen. Why? Because many of these groups had fled from jurisdictions where they were the dissenter from the national church. And in fact, what ended up happening, at least in the short term, is the Establishment Clause actually protected the existence of state churches. Did you know for a long time in Massachusetts, your taxpayer dollars literally help pay pastors' salaries? That was the law in Massachusetts. State after state had a specific state church. There was a recognition that individuals could form communities, organize their communities around shared beliefs, and govern them according to their shared beliefs, so long as they protected the rights of others to think, believe, and act in accordance with their deepest beliefs. All of that makes a whole heck of a lot of sense, right? It seems like, in hindsight, to us, well, that's just common sense. I mean, why on earth would a Presbyterian want to kill a Catholic? I mean, there were years that the question would be reversed. Why on earth wouldn't a Presbyterian want to kill a Catholic? I mean, that was how deeply felt the hostility was. But we upended that. We changed that, and we did it in a particular way where we did it without impairing the robustness of the religious practice in the United States of America. The United States of America, unlike almost any other first world country, has continued its arc of technological development, political development, economic development, all of these things while maintaining a very vibrant and healthy Christian presence and religious presence in the country. Much different from Western Europe. Much different. Where church and state were so closely identified, so closely linked, that the horrific errors of the state and the horrific oppression of the state got to be closely linked, very and inextricably linked with the church. So we were able to maintain a culture in which religious faith was vibrant and alive. People would come to the United States of America secure in the knowledge that even during waves of persecution, and there were waves of persecution, it was never as bad as it was in Europe. You could still form a community. You could still practice your faith. Police weren't going to come to your door if you're holding a Bible study. Police weren't going to be disrupting your worship. This was a place of liberty. This was a place of freedom. And that was a revolutionary act. Now, that doesn't mean that at all levels of American society that religious faith has flourished and been vibrant. There's a joke, now I'm sure some of you have heard it, that as the American elite grows less religious, there's a joke that the least religious country in the world is Sweden, the most religious country in the world is India, and the United States is a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. And there's a lot of truth to that. It's one of the reasons why our elite has a hard time understanding and grasping the importance of religious liberty. So that's our situation. We began with a worldview that imperfectly said, each new discrete group can believe and act in accordance with their deepest beliefs. That means social peace. That means social harmony. It doesn't mean utopia, because beliefs often clash and their belief systems that are inconsistent with each other. But the way that we dealt with that, the way that we handled that, was essentially saying you had, and I'm oversimplifying legal doctrine here, but the state itself could not overpower your religious liberty unless it was doing so in a way that was narrowly tailored to justify, in the least restrictive means, to justify or in furtherance of a compelling state interest. Let's just put this in non-legalese. The state couldn't overcome your religious beliefs unless it had a darn good reason for doing so. One that would protect others, one that would preserve the rights of others primarily, preserve important governmental systems that would break down in the event that it recognized large-scale religious exemptions. It had to have a darn good reason for doing so. And that's a system that worked for a very long time. It's a system that was actually in place during the Civil Rights Movement. During the Civil Rights Movement, when African Americans made great and enormous strides in achieving legal equality in the United States of America, this religious liberty regime was in place. How do we know this? We know this because actually there were circumstances in which segregation, people who were segregating lunch counters, segregating their restaurants, seeking to overturn civil rights laws, sometimes claimed a religious liberty exemption from civil rights laws applicable to people of all races. The Supreme Court laughed those claims out of court, essentially saying, well, these civil rights laws were in furtherance of a compelling state interest. There was a darn good reason why the state was saying that businesses that were open for public or that were open to the public had to serve people regardless of race. And so our country has protected religious liberty. Religious liberty has thrived. Churches have thrived with great social peace and social harmony in spite of tremendous religious differences. And we look at that now and we go, oh, well, that's just life. That's just the way things are. No. It's an absolute historical aberration. You have to be able to understand that. It's a historical aberration. It is highly unusual. It was not inevitable. It was the product of wisdom and forethought and divine providence that we're in this position. And here's the thing, guys. If you change that legal regime, you will change the reality under which we live. If you begin to tell mass numbers of Americans that they can no longer believe and act in accordance with their deepest beliefs, what are they going to do? Are they going to change their deepest beliefs? Unlikely. Very unlikely. Or are they going to find a way to believe and act in accordance with them? That history shows us is what people do. You cannot hector someone and scold someone and scream at someone out of their most deeply held beliefs. Now, you can sometimes expose that what they say is their most deeply held belief isn't. You can expose that with peer pressure. You can expose that with scolding. You can expose that with persecution. But you will not persecute, hector, scold, stigmatize someone out of what is the deepest belief that they have. Let me give you an example. It's often said, I didn't come up with this, I first heard it from Ravi Zacharias, who's outstanding, but he said, in the battle of ideas, stigma tends to defeat dogma. And what he means by that is, in the battle of ideas, condescension, insults, ridicule tend to trump assertions of belief and principle and ideas. And so what we often end up doing, particularly with Christian kids, when we send them off to secular schools, is we prepare them for the wrong battle. You'll often have people who send their kids to school and they'll teach them apologetics. They'll teach them, here's why the Bible is canon. Here's how we can trust what the Bible has to say. Here's a comprehensive worldview training from outstanding Christian organizations. And so you come as a student ready to debate these issues, and the first thing you hear from one of your classmates isn't, so why is it that you believe the New Testament is the inspired Word of God? To which you can respond, oh, let me tell you, it is homophobe, bigot, superstitious. No, I'm not. You're a bigot? No, and nobody knows how to deal with that, and they'll often begin to retreat into their shell. This was my own experience. I went to law school. I went to college at a small Christian college in Nashville, Tennessee. Let's see who's heard of it. See if the marketing team is doing its job. All the way on the West Coast, who has heard of Lipscomb University? One person. That is sad, okay? This is a university that when I attended it was 90+% Church of Christ, a cappella Churches of Christ, which is a very, very fundamentalist Southern denomination. I just called them a denomination, which they will stone me for later because they were actually the one true church. And so I went to Lipscomb, grew up in the Church of Christ. Lipscomb's sort of like the Notre Dame for the Church of Christ, and had a great time there, but it was a very, very conservative place. Well, how conservative was it, you ask? In 1988, yes, that's how old I am, I joined the College Republicans, and we were trying to help George H.W. Bush beat Michael Dukakis in the presidential race. And one of the first things that we did was we canvassed our dorms. And in canvassing the dorms to find which dorms we needed to target for campaigning, we found that the numbers were kind of like this. About 85% of our students were going to vote for Bush. About 10% were going to either not vote or go for an independent, and 5% were going to go for Dukakis. So we immediately disbanded the club because we were not going to improve on 85%. I mean, we thought at that point, all we're going to do is harm. We're just going to cause problems. So we disbanded the club. Super conservative place. So I got into Harvard Law School under the Redneck Affirmative Action Plan, and I was incredibly intimidated by this, incredibly. I went to high school in rural Kentucky. I went to college in, as I said, a conservative Christian school, and so I loaded up on books. The summer between college and law school, I took a crash self-taught course in theology, in church history, and Christian apologetics. I read some of the best books of my life about Christian apologetics. Here's how you answer this objection. Here's how you answer that objection. And I came ready for theological combat. That is what I couldn't wait. Man, I'm going to teach all these like Stanford kids about the origins of the Nicene Creed, and it's going to be awesome. But then I got there, and it was this atmosphere of incredibly repressive political correctness. All the stuff that you see in universities around the country now was happening at Harvard at that time, except in many ways worse. One of the first times that I raised my voice in class to make a comment, rather than respond, I was booed and hissed and shouted down. One time even, I was shouted down by my own professor. This was a fun moment. We were talking about abortion. We were taking a class called Child, Family, and the State, which was my own stupid fault for taking this class. And so we began to talk about abortion, and the professor would not use the term unborn child to describe, or fetus to describe an unborn child. She instead used the term clump of cells, or biologic product. So I just thought that was propaganda. So I raised my hand and I said, well, I understand you're not going to use the term unborn child, which was, the term preferred by the pro-life movement. I said, but, look, clump of cells is just misleading. From the moment of conception, an unborn child has a DNA that is distinctly unique and separate from their mother and from their father. In other words, it's a distinct living human organism. It's not a toenail, it's not a tumor, it's not a squirrel, it's a human organism. Scientifically, it's a human being. So if you're not going to say unborn child, can you at least use a scientific term like fetus? Rather than hitting us over the head with this, propaganda, which I didn't say that, but that was my unspoken implication. I think that's a reasonable point. Don't y'all think that's reasonable? So I get about halfway through it, and here's the response. Like literal screaming. And then all of the students that, I called them her posse, the students who kind of followed her around campus and hung on her every word that she was going to write their recommendations for judicial clerkships, started screaming as well. Just screaming and yelling. And so fortunately my voice carries, so I just raised my voice and I got through the point. But that's not what I signed up for. That's not what I signed up for. What I found again and again and again was that when I was interacting with these graduates of some of the most prestigious schools in the nation, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, again and again I was encountering people who had grown up in the United States of America, attended elite education, and had never, ever talked, much less had a serious conversation with, a thoughtful Christian conservative or a Christian conservative at all. Not at all. They were completely unfamiliar with my worldview. They were utterly unfamiliar with these aspects of American history. They were utterly unfamiliar with any viewpoint other than their own, and they saw people like me as instruments of evil in this world, as discriminators. And this is what I began to realize. This is going to be the challenge to religious liberty going forward, is going to be a cultural consensus that people like me need to shut up. It's not going to be necessarily the law. And in fact, that is what we are beginning to see happen now. If you're going to survey the law applicable to religious liberty, Yeah, it's got problems. I disagree with the case of Employment Division v. Smith, but we have multiple workarounds for that right now. There are Religious Freedom Restoration Acts in many states. There's a National Religious Freedom Restoration Act. If you look at the core legal doctrines surrounding religious liberty, you tend to win. A plaintiff who's attacking a religious liberty issue, a government action that inhibits religious liberty, they tend to win. Not all the time, but they tend to win. I did religious liberty litigation for 2 decades. And by the grace of God, I didn't lose a religious liberty case. We tend to win. However, and this is true even in the Obama administration, the most important religious liberty case of the last decade was Hosanna Tabor versus EEOC, Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran School versus the EEOC, and where the Obama administration took the position, essentially, that non-discrimination laws could apply to hiring and firing decisions of ministers. Okay? That's an extreme position. That's a position that can essentially would allow a rejected pastor candidate to sue their church, claiming discrimination on any number of bases, which would inject the state directly into adjudicating religious disputes over core religious issues. The Obama administration lost that 9-0. That means they couldn't even win over the notorious RBG, okay? And if you're on the left and you can't win over the notorious RBG, you are on the extremes, okay? So one of the core protections for the First Amendment were protected by the Supreme Court in religious free exercise, protected by the Supreme Court 9-0. But do you honestly sit here and feel like if you go into the workplace, let's say you're an evangelical Christian, let's say you're a conservative Catholic, if you're going to go work at Facebook or Google or Apple or anywhere, PayPal, eBay, Amazon, and you believe that marriage is reserved to a covenant relationship between a man, lifelong covenant relationship between a man and a woman, do you think you're going to feel free to express that view in your workplace? If you think you're free to express that view in your workplace without consequence, you're an idiot, because you're not free to express that view freely in the workplace. However, if you have a contrary view, that marriage is essentially the union of two loving people of any gender, and that lasts for only as long as those two people wish it to last, which, under no-fault divorce, literally a marriage is less binding than a refrigerator warranty, and that's the truest legal statement you'll hear today. You can shout that from the mountaintops. You can put that on a sticker in your cubicle. You can hang that from a banner from your office window. So one point of view is going to be entirely welcome, another point of view is not. If you're on social media, and unless your friends are entirely people of like mind, what happens to you when you express an orthodox Christian view of gender or human sexuality? Not much good, I can tell you that. So what ends up happening? What ends up happening is we're beginning to create through a cultural change, we're creating a two-tiered system where people who believe one set of values about life and the deepest meanings of life enjoy the full range of access to American economic opportunity. They can work without shame, without fear, without any level of secrecy, without being in any kind of closet whatsoever, in the most elite corporations, in the most elite cultural institutions, in the most elite academic institutions. No problem. If you're an Orthodox Christian, you're going to face some choices. Do you kind of dive into that closet? Do you kind of keep your head down? Do you remain quiet and then have at least some access to all of that economic and cultural opportunity? Or do you make your voice known and heard, and do you risk being shut out? That's the dynamic we're beginning to see today. And the existence of that dynamic, trust me, is deeply divisive and causes deep anger and resentment. Deep anger and resentment. Which brings me back to, or not back to, for the first time, the name of all names. Donald J. Trump. You're in California, the state that's single-handedly responsible for giving Hillary Clinton a popular vote victory. There's a chance you probably don't know a whole lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. And I come at this from I wasn't the leader of the Never Trump movement, but I was part of SEAL Team 6 of the Never Trump movement. So I didn't vote for the man. I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton either. But if you want to begin to understand why, in spite of all of his obvious failings as a human being, people rallied to support him so strongly, one of the reasons is precisely because they were being told not to. Precisely because they were saying, you're a bad human being if you do this. You're a terrible person. And all of the same people who are saying you're a terrible person for voting for Donald Trump are the same people who are saying you're a terrible person for believing the Bible is true. You're a horrible human being for not agreeing with me on marriage issues, or that Caitlyn Jenner is Caitlyn and not Bruce. You're a horrible person for thinking that dudes can't be pregnant. Okay? You're a horrible human being for that. And so all of these people telling you you're a horrible human being, you know, the secrecy of the voting booth is a pretty magnificent thing. There are all kinds of people who walked into that voting booth and said, horrible this, and they voted for Trump. Not because they were down with the Trump program to the extent they even knew what it was, or because Trump doesn't. Because they were sick of being told what to think, how to act, and sick and tired of a system that was being created that is two-tiered. If you believe what the cultural elite tells you to believe, you enjoy all of the fruits of the American economy. If you do not believe what the cultural elite tells you to believe, you've got some tough choices to make. Consider this in the Elite Academy. And this statement, I promise you, is 1,000,000% true. We just had a horrific dictator die, Fidel Castro. And he was just a dictator, guys. He had his boot on the face of the Cuban people for generations. He imprisoned and slaughtered dissidents. More than 1 million people fled his island. It was so oppressive. It was a house of horrors that was propped up again and again by people who ran larger and larger houses of horrors, like the Soviet Union, like Chavez's Venezuela. So he was a dictator. For generations, you had a better chance getting tenure at an elite university in the United States of America if you openly liked Fidel Castro than if you openly loved Jesus Christ. That's an absolutely true statement, guys. Just go through the ranks of our elite academic institutions. How many openly, outwardly faithful Christians are teaching at those schools? How many? 1 or 2, typically 0 in many academic departments. That's the world that we've been living in. And it's become so common that these institutions are unaware of their own bias because they're simply going to look at what you have to say. If it's coming from a faith perspective, coming from a Christian perspective is just not scholarship. It's just not credible. I had a fun case, and then I got a couple minutes I'll open up for questions. I had a really fun case. My last major case before I went from being a lawyer with a writer hobby to being a writer with a lawyer hobby, which is a transition I wholeheartedly endorse, but only after 20 years of litigation. You know, this is a nice change of pace. But my last case that I had, major case, was on behalf of a professor named Mike Adams. Now, some of you may know who Mike Adams is. He's a columnist often for townhall.com, Daily Wire. He was a criminologist, sociologist at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and he's a bomb thrower. I mean, I used to joke and I call him Dan Coulter because he's like the dude version of Ann Coulter. One of my favorite column titles of his was The Old Rugged Crossdresser. So that sort of gives you a flavor for how he communicates. Well, he's also a darn good teacher. He was consistently top in his department in student evaluations. He out-published his peers. He had gotten tenure as a liberal and an atheist. He became a Christian shortly after receiving receive tenure, and he was a very outspoken liberal atheist, published extensively, then became an outspoken conservative Christian, published extensively, and came up for full professor. He was denied promotion, in spite of the fact that nobody with his record had ever been denied promotion before in that department. Nobody, not one person. In spite of the fact that his publication record outstripped previous people who'd just gotten tenure. Despite the fact that he was the highest rated teacher in the department by the students, in spite of the fact that he'd received multiple teaching awards, including one award that set apart him above all other members of the faculty for his service to the university community, did not receive the promotion. We filed a lawsuit. It took 7 years, guys, to get to a jury. 7 years. Now, there's a joke about the U.S. justice system. The great thing about it is everyone gets their decade in court. This was his decade in court, okay? He fought it for 7 years because the university steadfastly said, first, he didn't enjoy free speech rights as a member of the faculty. That anything that he published, so long as he listed that on his CV as a professional accomplishment, was not free speech, it was work-related speech, and therefore not protected by the Constitution. The trial court bought that argument and dismissed the case. Fortunately, the Fourth Circuit reversed and set an outstanding precedent that's being used today to protect professors' academic freedom and free speech, sent it back to the trial court. They then tried to file a motion for summary judgment, did file a motion for summary judgment asking it to be dismissed because there's just not enough insufficient evidence of bias. The trial court rejected that motion for summary judgment. We went through multiple sessions of mandatory mediation that I wish I could tell you about because that was so freaking absurd, but I can't. So we went through multiple sessions of mediation and then had a trial. And in that trial, we laid the case out exactly as I laid it out here. And I cannot even tell you how arrogant they were going into this trial. Because they were so in their own bubble, they just assumed that everyone would see the world the way they saw it. I'll give you a prime example. He had written a book about academic freedom problems in the modern American university. He called it The Ivory Tower of Babel. It was a good book. It was story after story after story. And they refused to give him any credit for writing that book, the promotion committee. And on the stand, why did you refuse? It wasn't a work of scholarly merit. Is that right? Have you read the book? Silence. Do you recall if you read the book? I have since read the book. When you denied the promotion, had you read the book? I don't recall. Now, this is a fun technique, guys. Do you recall giving your deposition in May of last year? Yes. Do you recall me placing you under oath in which you promised to tell the truth under penalty of perjury? Yes. Do you recall your answer in that deposition when I asked you if you had read this book when you made a determination that it wasn't of academic merit? No. Let me read it to you. That's when law is fun, guys. Okay. So she hadn't even read it when she made a determination it wasn't of academic merit. She assumed it wasn't because it was from a Christian, it was from a conservative, and it was making a Christian conservative argument, so that couldn't possibly be academic. It had to be all this faith mumbo jumbo, and that has no place in the academy. That's just the worldview. And they surround themselves with it so much that they can't even see their own bias. Well, fortunately, ordinary people can. They were very arrogant about the composition of the jury. It was 12 people, 3 guys, 9 women. It was half white, half black from rural North Carolina. And and several of them had jobs and careers that indicated that they were probably left of center. So we thought we had a largely liberal jury. But they're also interested in fairness. And I remember closing the argument, and I basically said, look, guys, and I laid this out in my closing argument. And I said, every generation of Americans has to take their turn respecting the right of free speech, has to take their turn hearing each other out and protecting the right of each one of us to hear opposing points of view. Why? Because we're not always right. John Stuart Mill said that free speech is valuable because 2 reasons. Number one, well, let's just first say, one reason why free speech is valuable is we're not God. We don't know everything that's right. So when I hear a contrary argument and it teaches me that something that I said before was wrong, that's good. Free speech has done its job. But what if I hear a contrary argument and I'm not persuaded? And in fact, I think I'm more right than I was yesterday, which is usually the case. Well, then free speech has done its job because it's also sharpened my thinking about my own point of view. It's enabled me to defend my own point of view. University of North Carolina in Wilmington is not God. None of those professors are God. They cannot tell you what is orthodox, to quote West Virginia v. Barnett, in law, politics, religion, culture. They can't do that. They just cannot. By law, they cannot. And one way you can protect this fundamental American right, this fundamental human right that preexists and stands outside of government, the government cannot remove, it can only try to suppress, is by rendering a verdict for Professor Adams. And it was so funny. It's one of these great moments for a lawyer. About halfway through, I see about half of the people are nodding along with me. And there was this one woman on the front row. When I said that, I heard her say unmistakably, mm-hmm. And I said, oh, this is going to be good. And after my co-counsel looks over at opposing counsel's seat, and he says, for the first time in 7 years, their faces fell because they realized, holy cow, we might actually lose this thing. And it took 70 minutes for the jury to order pizza. No, wait, to select a foreman, to select a pizza topping, which takes my family 70 minutes all by itself, to order pizza, consume it, and then to render a verdict for Mike Adams. And what that told me is that the conception and the argument for free speech, for religious liberty, for freedom of expression, for the freedom to act and believe in accordance with your deepest principles is a message that Americans still want to understand and still can hear and be persuaded by. Yet we're facing an elite culture that is not humble, that has decided that it has all of the answers. It has all of the answers on law, on human sexuality, on morality, on identity. It has all those answers. And so its job and its role in society is to make sure you either agree, or if you don't agree, you just conform. But that's fundamentally contradictory to this vision right here. And it's fundamentally unsustainable for a nation of our size and diversity. So here's the deal, guys. Either we relearn how to respect and accommodate and provide for the fact that we live around people who have profoundly different points of view from ours and profoundly different beliefs, and give them the space to live and act according to those beliefs, we are headed for a national crisis of the highest order. That's just a reality. That's what history teaches us. That's a universal conceit throughout history, because people don't change their deepest beliefs just because they're told to. They tend to find a way to act in accordance with them. All right, that's it. Questions? Happy to take any questions. Yes?
You mentioned the civil rights laws, and that the court said that there was a compelling state interest for like restaurants and
restaurants in the South to not deny access to African Americans, yes.
What's the difference between that and the non-discrimination laws?
So, boy, how much time do you have? So, a lot of times, I'm so glad you asked that question. A lot of times people will say, are you familiar with cases like Arlene's Flowers? Where a person asks for a floral arrangement for a gay wedding, and the florist says, hey, you know what, I'll get you a floral arrangement for a congratulations on your promotion event, a floral arrangement for congratulations on your new job, for happy birthday, but I can't participate in a same-sex marriage ceremony. I don't want to participate in that. And people go nuts, and they say, Jim Crow, Jim Crow. Okay, all right. The short answer to that is it's an idiotic comparison. The longer answer to that is here's why it's an idiotic comparison. So in any given community, in the Jim Crow regime, a person who's African American in the South could not stay in a hotel, any hotel, that was also open to white people. They could not eat in a restaurant, any restaurant that was open to white people. They typically could not vote. If they tried to vote, they would likely die. It was a two-tiered society in every way. And it was a representation of the failure of the Reconstruction effort following the Civil War. And it was a direct descendant, and it was if you've heard the phrase, the badges and incidents of slavery, it was a direct consequence of the South's continual effort to maintain the two-tiered society and to preserve the badges and incidents of slavery. And so for that reason, and also because we'd fought a civil war to end slavery that had cost more lives than World War II, World War I, and every other American war combined with a nation with a much smaller population, we said, you know what? There's a compelling governmental interest to override the normal property rights that you would have as an owner of a small business. Now, another thing to realize is if you were an owner of a small business in the South and you disagreed with Jim Crow and you wanted African Americans to come into your store, you risked dying. So this wasn't a regime where property owners were free to do what they wanted to do with their property. It was a regime that systematically, comprehensively suppressed one set of Americans for the benefit of another set of Americans and established and reestablished and reinforced the badges and incidents of slavery. That's Jim Crow. The current battle over flowers is that if I'm a dude wanting to marry another dude, and there's 50 florists in town, maybe one of them might not want to serve me. Maybe. In fact, I'd probably go my whole life without encountering a florist who didn't want to serve me for my wedding. I mean, the number of cases like this around the country are infinitesimally small. Infinitesimally small. That's not Jim Crow, guys. It's nothing like Jim Crow. And moreover, it's directly infringing on the free speech of the florist in this way. All you have to do is flip around or the baker. All you have to do is flip around the hypothetical. Let's suppose I'm a white dude. We don't have to suppose I'm a white dude. Let's suppose, as a white dude, I come in and I say, hey, could you bake me, to an African American baker, can you make me a Confederate flag cake? And it says, yay, Jeff Davis on it, okay? Should the African American baker have to do that? Should they have to do that? Or if they're Jewish, should I walk in and say, can you bake a swastika cake for me, please? Almost every person you'd ever ask that question to says, well, no, you can't force somebody to express a view on a contentious topic that they don't believe in. Bake your own darn cake, or find someone else who will bake that cake happily. And yet somehow when it's flipped around to gay marriage, then it's, well, this is, Jim Crow? What? Are you kidding me? It's an unbelievable comparison. And so we've lost all historical perspective, all of it. I'll give you another example. We had a situation, and you know what? People are getting sick of the comparison, sick of it. So we were in Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt imposed a policy that said every student organization, every religious student organization has to be open to leadership by people of any belief system. So in other words, the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship had to judge an application for leadership of a Christian organization by a Muslim and a Christian and an atheist without regard to religion. There's a word for that. Idiotic, okay? No one thinks along those lines. Does the Democratic Party say, hey, we're going to accept, look, we're looking at Keith Ellison right now. We're looking at Dean. We're looking at Donna Brazile staying on. And by the way, Reince Priebus, if you're sick of working for Trump, you can apply too. And I promise we won't evaluate your application based on your allegiance to the Democratic Party at all. It's absurd. It's absurd. But that's the rule they impose. They're a private university. They could impose it. Students revolted. Hundreds of students showed up at an open forum. Hundreds of students. And the professor, or the dean in charge of this policy, compared them to segregationists. Think about that. The notion that a Baptist student group wants a Baptist leader is like George Wallace. And that term segregation or racism, it's lost its meaning. It's lost its meaning at that point. He was drowned out by booze. It was the first time I'd ever seen that on a college campus. And if I'd been paying attention and been seeing trends the way I should see trends, I would have known something's changing in the air in the American public and its view of this hectoring and this scolding. Something is changing. People are getting sick of it, especially when they live outside of certain urban and academic bubbles. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I have family in Cuba. My mother and grandparents fled there in 1968 to live in California. And they've told me many stories about how there's not enough toilet paper, not enough ration of food. That we'll send over small little trinkets, and about half of it will actually get into the hands of my family. And to see the lauding of such a brutal dictator by so many progressives in our own nation, and by and at best a neutral statement by our own president of the United States, is to me sickening. And to see that we are on the cusp, and could be on the cusp, of electing a socialist to be president of the United States in the next 10 years is appalling to me. So my question to you is, what can we do as law students, future lawyers, and future leaders to change the culture so that we can change the politics, so we don't head away with the devil?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So I'm going to give you, in 3 minutes, my formula for cultural engagement. Are you ready? All right. It's got 3 letters. HAC. H-A-C. All right. Humble, apathetic, conviction. Okay? What does this mean? Number one, it's incredibly important that we approach the public square with humility. If we're going to make an argument, and if we're going to make the case that one of the reasons why free speech is so important is that none of us is God and none of us holds all truth, don't act like you're God and don't act like you hold all truth. What ends up happening when you approach the public square with arrogance, particularly as a conservative, is you reinforce every negative stereotype of you that exists, and you close people's ears. Because one of the difficulties we have, particularly in this culture, is if you're really going to engage with the left, you're often having to do it in their own bubble, where they're coming at you with an awful lot of prejudices and an awful lot of stereotypes. Don't live the prejudice, don't live the stereotype. The opposite of political correctness, in my view, is truth and conviction. The opposite of political correctness isn't, excuse my language, assholery, okay? And so an awful lot of people don't understand that, and they think that they're opposing political correctness by being a jerk. That's not the case. So humility, but you have to have a thick skin. That's the apathetic part. You are apathetic to personal attacks. You do not take the bait. You are not shamed into silence. And I chose that word very carefully, because if you can be easily provoked, you'll just end up fighting fire with fire. You'll end up getting angry. You'll end up getting emotional. You'll end up being intimidated. You'll end up being scared. You have to take the slings and arrows with a degree of indifference, almost like it bores you. Oh, you're calling me a bigot today? Can you wake me when it's over? Can we actually have a conversation after that? Because what I have found is when you express outrage over it, then the whole conversation is about being called a bigot, not about the underlying topic. So, humble, apathetic, and then conviction. Do not lose sight of your ideals. So what you're trying to do is get the conversation to here as fast as possible. That's what you're trying to do. Here's what I believe. Here's why I believe it. Here's why not only is it something that I believe that is good for me, here's why thing that I believe is good for all of us, that contributes to human flourishing, that makes all of our lives better. We got to get to that as soon as possible. And if you get bogged down in the style points, and if you get bogged down in the screaming match, you're never going to get to here. Now, the unfortunate thing is there's a lot of financial incentive to stay at the screaming match if you're a conservative. Because just like, there's the John Oliver, do you know how many times like John Oliver and Colbert and Jon Stewart destroyed the GOP? Okay, well, it turns out they didn't actually destroy much of anything, but there's a corresponding economy of that on the right. Watch how this person owns this feminist or annihilates this, I mean, it's good to, it's kind of fun sometimes to watch and whoa, yeah, look at that screaming social justice warrior lose their mind. Okay, it's just as useful for us as John Oliver destroying the GOP is useful to them, which is not at all, okay? And so this is where you're wanting to go as fast as possible, and this is where it's so hard to stay. It's so hard to stay here. And the last thing I would say to you that's so critically important, particularly if you're a Christian voice in this culture, live your values. Live your values. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You've got to do that. Because it doesn't matter what you say. If you live a different way, if you compromise when you know you shouldn't compromise for short-term political expedience, you're going to lose your capacity to influence the other side. Who cares if you're famous on your own side? Big deal. That's easy. It is easy to get famous on our own side. Just be more outrageous than the next guy. Just be angrier than the next guy. Just provide better TV than the next guy. And then congratulations, you're influencing exactly nobody, but you've got a pretty good bank account. So to get there, you got to live your values. You got to go where the other side is, and you got to lead with humility, and you have to have a thick, thick skin. So that's it. Hack. Be a hack. Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.